they were not killed. That was the cruelty. When Rome defeated a king, his armies were crushed, his banners burned, his name erased from future treaties. But his daughters, those born into silk tents and marble halls, were kept alive. And in Rome, survival was often more terrifying than death. The Roman legions believed conquest was incomplete unless the bloodline itself was broken. Not just defeated on the battlefield, but humiliated, displayed, and bent into symbols of Roman dominance. And so, when foreign kings fell, their daughters became trophies, living proof that Rome ruled not only lands, but destiny. The war had ended at dawn. By sunset, the city was silent except for the crackle of burning roofs. The defeated king lay dead near the gates, his armor stripped, his crown already claimed by a Roman officer who laughed as he weighed it in his hands. But inside the palace, the conquerors found what they had come for. The daughters. They were dragged from inner chambers where no male stranger had ever stepped before. Some were barely old enough to understand what defeat meant. Others were women raised to rule, educated in statecraft, trained to command respect. All of that vanished the moment Roman hands seized their wrists. Roman generals did not treat these women as prisoners of war. Prisoners could be exchanged. Prisoners had value. Royal daughters had meaning. They were bound not in chains, but in silk ropes, an insult disguised as mercy. Their names were recorded carefully. Their faces studied. Their posture noted. A general needed to know how best to use them. For Rome, this was policy, not impulse. The daughters of defeated kings were marched before the legions. Not naked, but dressed in the remnants of their former status, torn gowns, broken jewelry, crowns bent just enough to mock. The soldiers were allowed to look, to whisper, to understand what victory truly meant. This, the general would say, gesturing toward them, is the end of rebellion. But the real horror did not happen on the battlefield. It began on the road to Rome. The journey could last months. Across deserts, mountains, seas. The daughters traveled in guarded wagons, never alone, never allowed privacy. Roman officers debated their fate openly, as if discussing livestock. Some would be paraded in triumphs. Some would be married off. Some would simply disappear. And the women knew it. Roman triumphs were spectacles of terror disguised as celebration. When a victorious general entered Rome, the city erupted in cheers. Gold, captives, weapons, and exotic animals filled the streets. And behind them came the daughters of kings. They walked last. Their fathers' names were shouted by the crowd, names that once commanded armies. Now they were followed by laughter. Children threw flower petals. Men stared without shame. Senators nodded in approval. To the Roman public, these women were proof that the gods favored Rome. To the generals, they were political tools. A royal daughter could be forced into marriage with a Roman ally, erasing her lineage in a single generation. Her sons would not rule her homeland. They would serve Rome or be absorbed into obscurity. Others were kept as hostages, raised within Roman households under strict supervision. They were taught Latin, Roman customs, Roman gods. Their original identities were slowly erased. You are Roman now, they were told. But they never were. They were reminders, living warnings sent back to their people. Occasionally, one resisted. Roman records speak coldly of such cases. A princess who refused to bow during a triumph. Another who spoke her native language instead of Latin when addressed by a magistrate. A third who attempted escape during the night. The punishments were swift. Not always violent, but devastating. Privileges revoked. Status reduced. A life of isolation imposed. Some were confined to temples under the guise of religious service. Others were quietly removed from public life, their existence fading into rumor. Rome did not need to kill them. Breaking them was enough. Yet perhaps the cruelest fate was reserved for those chosen to live. A defeated king's daughter could be assigned to a Roman general's household, not as a servant, but not as a guest. She would dine at the table, walk the gardens, hear political conversations she was never meant to understand. Her presence sent a message, even royalty kneels here. Every gesture was controlled. Every word monitored. She could never forget who owned her future. Some generals prided themselves on restraint. They boasted of how civilized Rome was compared to barbarians. And yet, the control they exercised was absolute. Marriage was often used as the final weapon. A royal daughter married without consent was not merely a woman wed against her will. She was a kingdom erased. Her children would carry Roman names. Her homeland would remember her not as a princess, but as the point where resistance ended. And Rome celebrated this as mercy. As years passed, stories of these women faded into footnotes. Their voices were not preserved. Roman historians wrote of generals, not daughters. But their suffering shaped history. Because every time a city considered rebellion, elders would whisper the same warning. Remember what Rome did to the king's daughters. And fear would do what armies could not. Rome did not just conquer land. It conquered memory. The daughters of defeated kings were living bridges between past and future, and Rome burned those bridges carefully, methodically, without apology. By the time a royal daughter reached Rome, her fate had usually already been decided. The general would consult senators, allies, priests. Her life would be discussed as a strategy, not a story. No one asked what she wanted. One such daughter arrived from the eastern kingdoms after a war that lasted 6 brutal years. She had been raised to believe she would rule beside her father. She spoke 3 languages. She understood diplomacy better than many Roman men. None of that mattered. In Rome, intelligence was dangerous. She was housed in a villa outside the city walls, guarded day and night. Visitors were permitted, but always supervised. She became a curiosity, a living relic of a defeated world. Roman women watched her closely. Some pitied her. Others feared her. Many resented her beauty, her royal bearing, the quiet dignity she still carried like armor. But Roman society allowed her no sisterhood. She was foreign. She was defeated. She was owned by victory. Eventually, the order came. Marriage. Not to the general himself, he had ambitions too high for such a union. Instead, she was given to a Roman noble whose loyalty needed reinforcement. The wedding was swift. Lavish. Public. To the crowd, it looked like honor. To her people, it was erasure. Her homeland's envoys were invited to attend. They watched in silence as their former princess spoke vows in Latin, not her native tongue. They returned home with the message Rome wanted delivered. Your blood now serves us. Other daughters were used differently. Some were placed in temples, forced into lives of religious silence. Officially, it was to protect their virtue. In reality, it ensured they would never marry, never produce heirs, never continue their line. A bloodline without children is a bloodline that dies quietly. And Rome was very good at quiet deaths. There were darker cases, rarely written about directly. Roman texts hint at discipline, correction, instruction. Euphemisms layered over cruelty. These women were isolated, controlled, watched until they no longer remembered who they had been. Many learned to survive by becoming invisible. They stopped speaking unless spoken to. They learned Roman customs perfectly, not to belong, but to avoid punishment. They learned when to lower their eyes, when to smile, when to disappear into shadow. Some lived long lives. But they never lived freely. The tragedy is that Rome believed this was justice. Roman ideology taught that the defeated deserved their fate. That mercy was weakness. That humiliation prevented future wars. And in some cruel way, it worked. Rebellions slowed. Kings hesitated. Leaders remembered that defeat did not end with death, but continued through their children. Even Roman soldiers understood the power of this system. They did not need to sack every city. The threat alone was enough. What history rarely tells us is how many daughters simply vanished. No records. No tombs. No names preserved. They were absorbed into households, into marriages, into religious institutions, into silence. Their stories ended not with execution, but with forgetting. And that was Rome's greatest weapon. Because empires fall not when armies lose, but when memories survive. Rome made sure these memories did not. Centuries later, scholars would debate Rome's greatness. Its laws. Its roads. Its philosophy. Few would speak of the daughters. Yet their suffering echoed in every province that bowed without fighting. In every treaty signed too quickly. In every king who chose surrender over resistance. Rome did not just conquer fathers. It conquered futures. And the daughters of defeated kings paid the price, quietly, completely, and forever.